The lawyer opened the beige file and slid a photograph across the coffee table. I stared at it for a moment. I honestly thought it was a mistake. The woman in the photograph was me. There was no doubt about that. The same dark hair I had worn in the late 90s, the same denim jacket, the same leather shoulder bag I carried everywhere back then. But I had never seen that photograph before in my life, not once. And what unsettled me wasn't the picture itself, it was the angle someone had taken it from. It was from far away, far enough that I never noticed them, far enough that whoever held that camera wasn't trying to preserve a memory, they were watching me. Your husband believes this photograph proves something important, the lawyer said calmly. Outside rain tapped against the living room windows. Inside nobody moved. I had walked into my house carrying the biggest news of my entire life, $28 million, and somehow that photograph felt heavier. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 62 years old. 3 weeks before the moment I'm about to describe, I believed I understood my marriage. I believed I understood the man sitting across from me. I believed that after 38 years together, there wasn't much left to surprise either of us. I was wrong, completely wrong, and before this story is over, you'll understand why. That Saturday began with sunshine, a bright spring morning with clear skies over northern Colorado, the kind of morning that makes retirement feel real. I left my attorney's office at 11:43 a.m., carrying a sealed envelope and a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The settlement had finally been approved. For 6 years, a lawsuit involving mineral rights on land my grandfather had owned had moved through hearings, appeals, paperwork, and delays. Most people thought the case would disappear. Most people thought the energy company would win. They didn't. That morning, my attorney confirmed everything, $28 million after taxes, legal fees, and distributions. The amount was still more money than I had ever imagined, having enough to change every remaining year of my life. I remember sitting in my car for almost 10 minutes afterward, not crying, not laughing, just staring through the windshield. People talk about winning money as if it creates instant happiness. It doesn't, at least not for me. What I felt was something quieter. I thought about breathing easier. I thought about helping my children. I thought about traveling. I thought about finally replacing the roof that David kept postponing. Mostly I thought about going home and sharing the news with my husband. 38 years together, we had struggled together, celebrated together, built a life together. Atlantic coast to the west, at least that's what I believed. I stopped at a bakery on the way home and bought a small lemon cake. David loved lemon cake. I even bought a bottle of wine, not expensive wine, just our favorite, the one we'd opened every anniversary for the last decade. The bakery box sat on the passenger seat beside me as I drove home. The mountains were still capped with snow in the distance, traffic was light, and everything felt normal. That's the strange thing about life, the biggest disasters rarely announce themselves. When I turned onto our street, I noticed an unfamiliar black sedan parked in front of the house. I slowed down, then I recognized it. Attorney plates. I had seen the car before David's lawyer, Martin Keller, a man I'd met twice, maybe 3 times. Professional, polite, expensive. I remember checking the clock, 4:17 p.m. Why was Martin at my house on a Saturday? I carried the bakery box in one hand and the envelope in the other. The front porch smelled faintly of wet wood. Clouds had rolled in while I was driving. Rain threatened overhead. I unlocked the door. The silence hit me first, not ordinary silence, the kind of silence that happens when a conversation ends abruptly. David and Martin were sitting in the living room. Papers covered the coffee table. Both men looked up. Both men froze. Not surprised, caught. That's the word, caught. David stood slowly. I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Real fear. Not worry. Not concern fear. The bakery box suddenly felt ridiculous in my hand. Margaret, David said, his voice sounding too careful. Martin adjusted his glasses. Mrs. Ellis, he said, you arrived at exactly the right moment. The right moment for what I set the cake on the kitchen counter and walked back into the living room. Nobody offered an explanation. Nobody smiled. Nobody asked where I'd been. That alone told me something was wrong. David usually asked questions. He liked information. He liked knowing where everyone was. Not today. Today he looked like a man waiting for a storm. Martin opened the beige file, he removed the photograph, and suddenly I was standing 27 years in the past, a young woman exiting a county records building the old courthouse annex in Denver. I remembered the day immediately, not because of the photograph but because of why I had been there. I had been reviewing inheritance documents after my father's death. Family records, property records, mineral rights, land ownership, the very land that had eventually become the source of the settlement. But I had gone alone. Or so I thought. I picked up the photograph. The paper felt old, the edges slightly yellowed. This was taken in 1998, Martin said. I looked at David. He looked away. That was unusual. David almost never looked away. Why do you have this? I asked. Neither man answered immediately. Rain began tapping against the windows. A cold wind rattled the branches outside. Martin folded his hands, then he said something that changed everything. Because your husband paid to have it taken. The room seemed to shrink. I heard the clock ticking above the fireplace. I heard rain hitting the glass. I heard my own breathing. But for several seconds I couldn't process the words. Paid. David paid for this photograph. Why? I looked at my husband. 38 years. 38 years sitting across from me, 38 years sharing meals, holidays, hospitals, birthdays, losses, victories, and suddenly I felt as though I was looking at a stranger. David opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Margaret, he said quietly. But I wasn't listening anymore because a single question had already taken hold inside my mind. If my husband hired someone to secretly photograph me 27 years ago, what exactly had he been planning? And how long had he been planning? David Ellis was 24 years old when I first met him, though he carried himself like a man already certain the world owed him a place near the front of the room. I was 21. We met at a county fair outside Fort Collins back when summer evenings still smelled like hay dust, fried dough, and gasoline from the old carnival rides. I was there with my younger sister, Claire, and David was working a booth for his uncle's real estate company, wearing a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled just high enough to show his forearms. He wasn't the handsomest man I'd ever seen. That isn't why I noticed him. I noticed him because he listened like every word mattered. When I told him I was studying education and wanted to teach history, he didn't make a joke about summers off the way most men did. He asked what period of history I loved most. When I told him the Great Depression, he smiled and said, "So you like stories about people surviving what should have broken them?" I remember that sentence. I carried it home with me. 16 months later, I married him in a small Methodist church with white siding, blue carpet, and a roof that leaked over the choir loft whenever the rain came sideways. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. My father shook David's hand at the reception and said, "Take care of my girl." David looked him straight in the eye and said, "Always, sir." That was David's gift. He knew what to say. Not too much, never sloppy, just enough. For a long time I believed that was character. It took me nearly 4 decades to understand that saying the right thing and doing the right thing are not relatives. They only look alike from a distance. We built a practical life, not glamorous, not tragic, just ordinary, in the way most long marriages are ordinary from the outside. I taught history at a public high school for 32 years. David bought and sold small properties, some successfully, some not. He called himself a developer, though most years that meant chasing loans, negotiating leases, and talking about deals that were always almost finished. When his deals worked, he was generous. When they failed, he was quiet. And when he was quiet, I learned not to ask too many questions. That is something many women of my generation understand, though we don't always admit it. We were taught to keep the peace, to believe in our husbands publicly, to handle the private disappointment with grace, to call it loyalty, when sometimes it was just fear of knowing too much. I helped when his accounts ran low. I signed papers when he said a second signature would make the bank comfortable. I covered our insurance twice when one of his projects fell apart. I taught summer school for 6 straight years because David said cash flow was temporary and dreams took patience. Maybe they do, but dreams should not always be paid for by the same person. My father saw David more clearly than I did. He never disliked him openly. That wasn't my father's way. Raymond Whitaker was a quiet man, a former county surveyor who trusted fence lines, deeds, and people who arrived on time. He had worked his whole life, measuring land other men argued over. He believed a document should say exactly what it meant, and a man should do the same. David made him uneasy. I knew it. I ignored it. After my father died in 1998, I spent weeks sorting through his old files. He left me 2 things of real value: a small farmhouse outside Loveland that had been in our family for generations, and mineral rights attached to land most people thought was worthless. David didn't show much interest at first, at least not obviously. He brought me coffee while I sat at the kitchen table with boxes of deeds and tax records. He rubbed my shoulders and told me not to rush. He called me honey in that soft voice he used when he wanted to sound protective. But slowly questions started appearing. Did your father ever explain exactly what those mineral rights cover? Are they only yours, or did they become marital property when we married? Do you need help with an attorney? Wouldn't it be easier if I organized all that for you? Each question sounded reasonable. That was the problem. David rarely pushed hard. He nudged, he suggested, he planted a thought and waited for you to mistake it for your own. I told him no at first, not sharply, just no. Those were my father's papers, and I wanted to understand them myself. The day in the photograph was June 12, 1000, 998. I remember because it was the day I found the original mineral deed recorded under my grandfather's name. I had driven to the old courthouse annex in Denver because one document in my father's files didn't match the county copy. A clerk helped me locate the missing page. I made 3 copies, put them in a blue folder and walked out through the glass doors around 2:30 inches the afternoon. That was when someone took the picture. I didn't know it then. I walked to my car thinking about my father, about how careful he had been, about how many people had probably told him those old rights were worthless. When I got home, David was gone. He returned 2 hours later with groceries he had not needed to buy and a receipt from a store across town. At the time I thought nothing of it. A husband runs errands, a wife buries her father, life continues. Now, sitting in my living room 27 years later, holding that photograph between my fingers, I remembered something else from that evening. David had asked me what I found at the records office, not casually, not the way a husband asks, because he is interested, he asked too quickly. I had told him I found what I needed. He smiled and kissed my forehead. Good, he said then, maybe now you can stop worrying. But he hadn't wanted me to stop worrying, he had wanted me to stop looking. Back in the present, Martin Keller reached for another document inside the file. David still had not sat down. His face had gone pale beneath his careful tan. Margaret, he said, before this gets dramatic, you need to understand that I was trying to protect us. I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because after 38 years he had chosen the oldest sentence in the book. Protect us. I looked down at the photograph again. There I was, younger, unaware, stepping out of a government building with my father's records in my hand, and somewhere nearby, someone had been watching me for the man I would go home to. A marriage can survive hardship, it can survive debt, it can survive grief, illness, and years when love feels more like duty than romance. But it cannot survive the moment you realize the person beside you has been standing on the other side of your life, keeping notes. What does this photograph prove? I asked. Martin Keller slid a second page toward me. This is about the origin of the settlement funds, he said, and whether your husband has a legitimate claim. There it was, not concern, not protection, not love. A claim. David finally sat down. He kept his hands folded between his knees. I had seen him use that posture in bank meetings, hearings, and conversations with contractors. He intended to outmaneuver, controlled, humble, prepared. But that afternoon he made one mistake. He underestimated the woman he had been married to for 38 years. He thought I would react like a wife. He forgot I had spent 32 years teaching teenagers to read primary sources, question motives, and never trust a single version of events. I placed the photograph back on the table, then I looked at my husband and said very quietly, "Explain it to me from the beginning." His eyes flickered toward Martin, and in that small movement, I understood something that chilled me more than the photograph. David was not the one in control of the room anymore. His lawyer was. Martin Keller began with the calm, rehearsed voice of a man who had billed hundreds of dollars an hour for learning how not to sound nervous. He explained that David believed the mineral rights tied to my grandfather's land had been managed and preserved through marital effort. He used those exact words, managed and preserved, as if the money had been a garden. David watered every morning as if he had stood beside my father in county offices, studied survey maps, corrected old deeds, paid filing fees, and carried boxes of records through 3 moves and 2 basement floods. David nodded at the right moments. He looked wounded, not greedy. That impressed me in a cold way, even after everything he understood performance. "Margaret," he said softly, "this isn't about taking anything from you. It's about recognizing what we built together." I looked at the photograph on the coffee table. "What we built together," I repeated. A younger version of me might have filled the silence, explained myself, defended my father, listed every year I had protected those documents, while David called them old paper. But age gives a woman certain gifts if she lets it. One of them is the ability to sit still while someone else exposes himself. "So I sat still," Martin continued. He said David had reason to believe the settlement resulted from assets that had been commingled during the marriage. He said there were questions regarding household funds used for preservation of the property. He said no formal action had been filed yet, but a petition could be prepared if necessary. If necessary, meaning if I did not cooperate. I listened until he finished, then I asked for copies. Martin glanced at David. There it was again, that quick, silent permission. "I don't think that's advisable before we clarify," Martin began. "You came into my house," I said still quietly, "with a photograph of me taken without my knowledge, documents concerning property inherited from my father, and a claim against money deposited in my name. I want copies." David leaned forward. "Maggie, let's not make this hostile." He had not called me Maggie in months, maybe longer. I smiled at him because my mother taught me there are moments when a smile is safer than a knife and almost as sharp. Then don't make it hostile, I said. Martin gave me partial copies. Not everything, just enough to make me think they wanted me frightened but not informed. That was their second mistake. Their first was letting me see the photograph. After Martin left, David stayed in the living room. He picked up the wine bottle I had brought home and looked at the label. Special occasion, he asked. The question was so ordinary, it almost broke something in me. I had imagined that bottle sitting between us at dinner. I had imagined David laughing, maybe crying, maybe wrapping his arms around me in that old familiar way, and saying we had finally made it through. Instead, he held it like evidence from a crime scene. I had good news, I said. He waited. I let him wait, then I took the bottle from his hand and carried it to the pantry. That night I slept in the guest room. I didn't slam a door, I didn't shout, I didn't accuse him of anything beyond what I could prove. I simply folded a blanket, took my phone charger, and closed the guest room door behind me. At 6:12 the next morning I called Claire. My sister answered on the fourth ring, her voice rough with sleep. Margaret, are you all right? No, I said, but I'm thinking clearly. That woke her up. Claire is 3 years younger than I am, and has never been good at pretending. She disliked David before she had a reason she could put into words. At Thanksgiving dinners she watched him the way a barn cat watches a snake near the feed room. I told her about the photograph, the lawyer, the claim. She was silent for so long that I checked the screen to make sure the call had not dropped. Then she said, "Do not talk to him alone again." That was Claire, direct, practical, fierce. "I need an attorney," I said. "You need a shark with a law degree. I need someone careful. You need both." By noon, Claire had connected me with Nathan Price, a property and trust attorney in Boulder who had handled a dispute for her former employer. His office was above a bank with large windows facing the Flatirons and a receptionist who offered coffee in a real mug, not a paper cup. I noticed details like that when I was scared, small, ordinary things, a brass nameplate, a dying fern near the window, the smell of toner and lemon furniture polish. Nathan Price was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, no wedding ring, no unnecessary charm. He read the pages Martin had given me without interrupting. When he got to the photograph, he paused. "Who took this? My husband says he paid to have it taken." Nathan looked up slowly. He admitted that in front of his attorney. Yes. Good. It was the first good thing anyone had said since I walked into my living room. I gave Nathan the timeline: my father's death in 1998, the mineral deed, the lawsuit, the settlement, David's business troubles, the questions David had asked over the years. I told him I had not told David the exact amount yet. Nathan leaned back in his chair. "Keep it that way." Then he said something I still remember word for word: "Mrs. Ellis, men like your husband rarely begin with the obvious move. By the time they put a lawyer in your living room, they've usually laid tracks somewhere else." How far back? That's what we find out. Over the next week, I became a woman with two lives. In one life, I lived quietly in my own house with a husband who had started speaking to me like I was fragile glass. David made coffee. He asked whether I wanted him to pick up groceries. He apologized for springing things on me, but never for the photograph, not once. In the other life, I gathered records, bank statements, tax returns, insurance payments, property maintenance, receipts, letters from my father, old filing confirmations from county offices. I opened boxes in the basement after David went to bed. I wore cotton gloves because some of the paper was brittle. Dust rose under the bare bulb. The furnace clicked on and off above me. I could hear David moving through the house, flushing a toilet, closing a cabinet, living inside a version of our marriage I no longer occupied. On the 6th night, I found the first real thread. It was in a file labeled Loveland Farm Utilities, a check copy from 2003, $5,000 paid from David's business account to a company called North Star Research Services. The memo line said land valuation. I had never heard of North Star. The next morning, Nathan's investigator found the company had been dissolved in 2011, but before it closed, it had operated as a private investigation and document retrieval firm. David had not paid for land valuation. He had paid someone to investigate my father's property. I sat at Nathan's conference table as he read the investigator's report. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic below. Nathan placed one finger on the page. "Margaret," he said, "your husband didn't start this when the settlement became real." I already knew what he was going to say, but hearing it still changed the air in my lungs. He started decades ago. The strange thing about betrayal is that once you finally see it, you begin finding its fingerprints everywhere. Not dramatic fingerprints. Not obvious ones. Small things, quiet things, the kind of details that seemed meaningless when they happened but become impossible to ignore once you understand the pattern. For nearly 4 decades I had explained David's behavior through the lens of marriage, a delayed answer, a forgotten conversation, an unusual expense, a private phone call. Marriage gives people explanations. Investigation takes them away. 3 days after Nathan Price discovered the payment to North Star Research Services, I sat across from him in his office again. A thick file rested on the conference table between us. Outside, late afternoon sunlight reflected off nearby office buildings. Cars moved slowly through downtown Boulder. Somewhere down the hall, a copier hummed steadily. Nathan slid several pages toward me. We found more. The words landed softly, the documents did not. Over the years, David had contacted multiple firms connected to property research, mineral rights investigations, and inheritance asset tracing. Never enough to attract attention, never enough to create a clear pattern by themselves. $5,000 here, $2,000 there, a consultation fee, a record search, a title review. Individually they looked harmless. Together they told a story, and that story had started long before the lawsuit, long before the settlement, long before anyone knew $28 million would ever exist. I stared at the dates 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006. David hadn't been preparing for the settlement. He had been preparing for opportunity. Any opportunity. Whatever my father's property eventually became. Nathan tapped the oldest payment record. People don't spend money gathering information for 20 years unless they believe the payoff will eventually be worth it. I nodded. The strange part was that I wasn't shocked anymore. That stage had passed. Shock belongs to discovery. What comes after is something colder clarity. I drove home in silence. The mountains were turning orange in the setting sun. Traffic moved normally. People filled restaurants, families pushed shopping carts across parking lots. Life continued. And yet my entire understanding of my marriage had shifted, not collapsed, shifted. Because I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. David wasn't pretending to love me all those years. That would have been easier, much easier. The truth was more complicated. He loved me in the way he understood love, but somewhere along the way he had also started seeing my inheritance as part of his future. To him, those two things were not mutually exclusive. That realization bothered me more than outright hatred ever could. When I arrived home, David was grilling steaks on the back patio. The smell of charcoal drifted through the spring air. He looked up when I stepped outside. "Hey," he said, just that. Hey, like nothing had happened. Like lawyers hadn't appeared in our living room, like hidden photographs didn't exist. Like 27 years of planning wasn't sitting in a file somewhere. "Hey," I replied. He smiled the same smile I had trusted for 38 years. For a brief moment I saw the young man from the county fair again, the one who asked thoughtful questions, the one who made me laugh, the one who danced with me in the kitchen while spaghetti boiled over on the stove during our first year of marriage. Then the moment passed because memory is not evidence, and I needed evidence. Over dinner, David was unusually attentive. He asked about my day, he refilled my water glass, he even offered dessert. Years earlier I would have interpreted those gestures as affection. Now they felt like strategy, not because they were fake but because they were timed. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think something important is approaching. And something important was approaching. David knew the settlement had been approved. He didn't know the amount, but he knew enough. That night after he fell asleep, I sat in the guest room reviewing documents on my laptop. At 1:14 p.m., Nathan sent an email. One sentence, "Call me tomorrow. We found the photographer." I didn't sleep much. The next morning I met Nathan at his office. For the first time since this began, he looked genuinely surprised. Not concerned, surprised. "The photographer is still alive." I blinked. 27 years. I hadn't expected that. "Can we talk to him?" Nathan nodded. "We already did." My pulse quickened. He handed me another folder. Inside was a statement. The photographer's name was Leonard Brooks, 74 years old, retired, living in Arizona. Back in 1998. He worked as a private investigator and surveillance photographer. The statement was detailed, painfully detailed. On June 12, 1998, he had been hired to photograph a woman leaving the Denver courthouse annex. Me, his client David Ellis. I read the line twice, then 3 times. The letters didn't change. Nathan continued. "Brooks kept records." "How good are the records?" Nathan almost smiled. "Margaret, this man documented everything: invoices, work, logs, mileage reports, camera notes, delivery confirmations, copies of checks, even handwritten observations. The kind of meticulous documentation investigators keep because someday they may need to defend their work." My hands felt cold. Nathan opened another folder. Inside was a photocopy of the original contract. Client name David Ellis. Date June 9, 1998. Assignment document subjects activities relating to county property records. I stared at the page. 3 days before the photograph. 3 days before I visited the courthouse. 3 days before David supposedly had any reason to know where I would be. A quiet realization settled over me. He had known exactly where I was going, because I had told him at breakfast. I remembered it clearly now. I had mentioned needing to drive to Denver to review county records. David had nodded while reading the newspaper, nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Then he hired someone to follow me. Not after before. The difference mattered a lot because following me afterward might have been curiosity. Planning it beforehand was surveillance. Nathan slid one final document across the table, the invoice paid in full. The signature at the bottom belonged to David. No ambiguity, no assumptions, no interpretation, just ink. Proof. For several moments neither of us spoke. The office was quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. I thought about every anniversary, every Christmas, every hospital visit, every difficult year, every promise, every ordinary Tuesday night. Then I thought about David sitting at a kitchen table in 1998, hiring someone to photograph his wife, not because he loved her, not because he feared for her safety, but because he wanted information. Nathan finally broke the silence. Most people in your position would confront him immediately. I looked down at the contract, then at the signature, then at the invoice. No. Why not? Because I finally understood something. The truth wasn't finished revealing itself. This photograph wasn't the beginning. It was evidence of a beginning, a very different thing. Someone willing to hire surveillance 27 years ago had almost certainly done more, much more. And if David believes his plan is still working, he will keep making mistakes. Nathan nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. As I stood to leave, he handed me certified copies of every document, the contract, the invoice, the investigator's statement, the payment records, all neatly organized, all legally authenticated. I placed them carefully inside my briefcase. The weight felt surprisingly comforting. Not because I enjoyed what they proved, but because facts are stable. Facts don't change depending on who tells the story. Outside the afternoon, sun shone brightly over Boulder. The mountains looked sharp against the blue sky. I stood beside my car for a moment. 27 years, nearly 3 decades. That was how long David's paper trail stretched. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't wondering whether my husband had betrayed me. That question was settled. Now I was wondering something else. If he had been planning this for 27 years, what was he expecting to happen next? People imagine legal battles as dramatic moments. A courtroom raised voices, someone pounding a table, someone storming out. In reality, the most dangerous battles usually happen long before anyone enters a hearing room. They happen in preparation, in paperwork, in silence. The hearing was scheduled for April 17th, 3 weeks after I found the surveillance contract. 3 weeks during which David became the best husband he had been in years. That wasn't an exaggeration. He brought flowers twice. He repaired a loose fence board without being asked. He suggested weekend drives. One evening, he even cooked dinner, chicken parmesan, my favorite. As I watched him move around the kitchen, opening cabinets and stirring sauce, I felt something I hadn't expected: sadness. Not grief, not longing sadness. Because for a few moments I could see the marriage we might have had if ambition had never entered the room. But life is not built on possibilities. It's built on choices, and David had made his. As the hearing approached, Nathan and his team continued working. Every few days, another piece appeared: a document, a statement, a financial record. The picture became clearer and uglier. The surveillance contract from 1998 wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the oldest surviving evidence. Over the years, David had repeatedly attempted to gather information regarding inheritance structures, property transfers, and trust mechanisms connected to my family's land. Never directly, never openly, always through intermediaries, consultants, researchers, attorneys, private firms. The pattern was undeniable. By the second week of April, Nathan's office had assembled an evidence binder nearly 4 inches thick. I remember staring at it on the conference table. 4 inches, 38 years of marriage reduced to paper. It seemed impossible, yet there it was. Meanwhile, David remained confident. That surprised me at first. Then I realized why he didn't know what we had found. He knew about the photograph, he knew about the argument over ownership, he knew Martin Keller had built a legal theory around marital contribution. But he believed the surveillance contract had disappeared long ago. He believed the photographer was dead. He believed the records were gone. Most of all, he believed I was still reacting emotionally. He underestimated preparation. That mistake would cost him everything. The hearing took place in a large conference room, rather than a courtroom. Polished wood table, neutral walls. Large windows overlooking downtown Denver. No jury, no dramatic spectators, just attorneys, legal staff, a retired judge serving as mediator, and the parties involved. David arrived wearing a navy suit I had bought him 12 years earlier. The suit still fit. He looked composed. Martin Keller looked even more confident. He greeted people politely, shook hands, smiled, a man expecting a productive afternoon. Nathan sat beside me, his binder resting on the table, closed, waiting. The proceedings began shortly after 9:00 a.m. Martin spoke first for nearly an hour. He presented David's position. He described marital effort, shared resources, joint sacrifice, mutual investment. Then he introduced the photograph. The image that started everything, projected on a screen at the front of the room. 7-year-old Margaret Whitaker leaving the county records building. Martin argued that the image demonstrated ongoing involvement by David in preserving and documenting the inherited assets. A strange argument, a weak argument, but presented carefully, methodically, professionally. David sat quietly throughout, occasionally nodding, occasionally taking notes, looking exactly like a reasonable husband seeking fairness. When Martin finished, he sat down with visible satisfaction. The mediator turned toward Nathan. "Mr. Price," Nathan stood. No theatrics, no dramatic pauses, just calm, professional, prepared. He opened the binder. Before addressing ownership, Nathan said, "I believe we should discuss intent." The room grew quieter. He lifted the first exhibit, the surveillance contract certified copy dated June 9, 1998. Client David Ellis. Assignment, document subject's activities relating to county property records. Martin's expression changed immediately. Only slightly, but I saw it, a tiny tightening around the eyes. Nathan continued. Then came the invoice, the payment record, the investigator's work log, the mileage report, the signed receipt. One after another, each document authenticated, each document verified, each document impossible to explain away. David stopped taking notes. The mediator adjusted his glasses. Martin flipped rapidly through his own file, looking, searching, finding nothing because there was nothing to find. The documents were real. Nathan wasn't finished. Next came the payments to North Star Research Services, then the property research contracts, then the consultation records, then the inheritance tracing reports. Year after year, decade after decade, a trail, a remarkably patient trail. The room changed. You can feel moments like that the exact second a narrative collapses. Until then, David had been a supportive spouse asserting a legal interest. Now he looked like a man who had spent nearly 30 years positioning himself around an inheritance. Those are very different things. Martin attempted several objections. Nathan answered each one with documents, not opinions, documents. At one point, David leaned toward Martin and whispered something urgently. Martin listened, then slowly shook his head. I will never forget that moment because it was the first time I saw fear in David's face, real fear. The same fear I had seen the day I walked into my living room. The same fear that had flashed across his eyes before he could hide it. By noon, the mediator requested a recess. People stood, coffee was brought in, conversations began quietly around the room. David remained seated, staring at the table. Martin stood beside him, speaking in low tones. I couldn't hear the words. I didn't need to. The body language said enough. Then Nathan approached me. There's one more thing. I looked up. He held a sealed envelope, thick, old, protected inside archival plastic. The document arrived this morning. My stomach tightened. What document? Nathan looked at the envelope, then back at me. It came from your father's estate records. I stared at it. The handwriting on the front was immediately familiar. I hadn't seen it in decades, but I knew it instantly. My father's handwriting, Raymond Whitaker. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What's inside? Nathan exhaled. We haven't presented it yet. A pause then, but if it's what I think it is? He looked toward David. This hearing is over. The envelope sat on the table between Nathan and me for several seconds. Neither of us touched it. The conference room buzzed quietly around us. Attorneys walked toward the coffee station. Someone laughed softly near the windows. Cups clinked against saucers, ordinary sounds. Yet all I could hear was my father's voice. Not literally just memory. The steady, careful way Raymond Whitaker spoke whenever something mattered. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Block letters precise. Surveyor's handwriting. The kind developed by a man who spent decades making sure measurements were accurate because mistakes became lawsuits. The front read, for Margaret if necessary. Nothing else. No date, no explanation, just those 3 words if necessary. Nathan carefully opened the protective sleeve. Inside was a folded letter, and beneath it several pages clipped together. I unfolded the letter first. The paper was yellowed with age. My father's signature appeared at the bottom. I recognized it immediately. The room seemed to disappear for a moment. It felt like sitting across from him again at the old farmhouse kitchen table. The letter was dated September 14, 2001, nearly 24 years earlier. I began reading. Margaret, if you are reading this, circumstances have forced questions I hoped would never become necessary. I pray I am wrong. I pray these concerns prove unfounded, but if they do not, I want you to have information I could not comfortably discuss while I was alive. I have reasons to believe David has shown unusual interest in family property matters that do not concern him directly. Over the last 3 years, several inquiries regarding our land holdings have reached me through professional contacts. Some were made indirectly, some were made through third parties, all eventually traced back to him. I hired an investigator to determine whether these inquiries were isolated incidents. They were not. My hands froze. I looked at Nathan. He already knew. The attached documents contained the investigator's report. My father had suspected something more than 20 years ago. More importantly, he had acted on it. The report was thorough, painfully thorough interview summaries, contact logs, copies of inquiries made to county offices, requests for ownership information, questions regarding mineral rights, questions regarding inheritance structures, questions regarding future transfers. Again and again, David's name appeared, not always directly, sometimes through business associates, sometimes through intermediaries, but the pattern was unmistakable. The investigator reached one conclusion. David demonstrated ongoing interest in obtaining control over future inherited assets belonging exclusively to Margaret Whittaker. Not current assets, future assets. My father had seen it long before I did. Long before the lawsuit, long before the settlement, long before $28 million entered the picture. I sat back slowly. The mediator announced that the hearing would resume in 10 minutes. Nathan closed the report. "You okay?" I nodded. Not because I felt okay, but because something had shifted. For weeks I had been trying to understand when David changed, when greed appeared, when planning began. Now I knew the answer. It hadn't started recently. It hadn't started with the settlement. It hadn't even started with the photograph. It had started decades ago, perhaps before our marriage reached 10 years, perhaps before I would ever have believed such a thing possible. The hearing resumed. Everyone returned to their seats. The mediator looked toward Nathan. "Mr. Price, you indicated you had additional evidence." Nathan stood. The room quieted. Then he presented my father's letter, every page, every report, every documented concern, every investigative finding. No exaggeration, no emotional argument, just facts. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced before, not uncomfortable, final. Martin Keller reviewed the documents, then reviewed them again. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone, completely gone. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, read another page, then another. Finally, he leaned toward David. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I watched David's face and I saw the exact moment he understood. Not that he might lose that part had happened hours earlier. No, this was the moment he realized the story he had spent years constructing had been documented by other people long before he ever tried to tell it. His version no longer mattered. The records did. The mediator asked several questions. Martin answered cautiously. Nathan answered directly. Then the mediator requested a final review period. 45 minutes later, everyone returned. The recommendation was clear. David's claim lacked merit. The evidence demonstrated a long-term pattern of efforts to position himself around inherited assets belonging solely to me. No ownership interest would be recognized. No share of the settlement would be awarded. No compensation, nothing. $28 million remained exactly where it belonged, in my name. The hearing ended shortly afterward. People gathered documents, chairs, moved folders, closed the ordinary sounds of legal proceedings, returning to ordinary life. David approached me as I packed my briefcase. For a moment he simply stood there, older, smaller, somehow not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone, the certainty, the performance all gone. "Margaret," his voice cracked slightly. I looked up. For the first time in weeks, he seemed unsure of what to say. Maybe for the first time in years. "I'm sorry." The words hung there, simple, late, incomplete, but real. At least I think they were. I studied his face. 38 years. A lifetime. A marriage, 2 children, countless memories, some beautiful, some painful, most ordinary. I didn't hate him. That surprised me. I expected hatred. Instead, I felt something quieter, acceptance. The truth had arrived. And truth once fully revealed removes the need for many emotions. I know, I said. Nothing more, just that. Because there was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to prove. The documents had already done that. 6 months later, I sold the old farmhouse. Not because I had to, but because I was ready. Part of the proceeds funded scholarships for future history teachers. My father would have liked that. Part helped my children. The rest remained invested carefully, conservatively, the way my father taught me. Sometimes people ask whether the $28 million changed my life. They're wrong. The money wasn't what changed my life, the truth did. The truth showed me that trust isn't built by promises, it isn't built by anniversaries, it isn't built by beautiful speeches or carefully chosen words. Trust is built by what people do when they believe nobody is watching. My father understood that. Nathan understood that. Eventually I did too. And if there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's this: pay attention to actions, not stories. Stories can be written, documents can be hidden, words can be rehearsed, but over enough years, the truth always leaves a trail. Eventually someone follows it. Before I go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered something about someone you trusted that completely changed the way you saw them? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell me where you're watching from today. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing and joining us for more journeys like this one. We have many more stories to share, and I'd love for you to be part of them. Until next time, take care of yourself, trust your instincts, and remember that the truth is often quieter than a lie, but it lasts much longer.